Hello, and welcome to Retro Roleplay, the series where we examine new titles with old school sensibilities. I'm your host, Nifty, bringing you some gameplay from Grim Dawn, the newest spiritual successor to old school titles like Diablo and Titan's Quest. So we're just going to jump into with some gameplay from my level 85 Commando. So the game loads us in Homestead, which is the title's largest home settlement. Here you can buy new equipment, exchange old skills for new skills, as well as take on any new quests that you might need. Going into our personal Rift Gate, we get access to the game's overworld map, where you can examine all the locations you can explore throughout the title, where you can combat enemies, farm for loot, and try to complete quests. In this case, we're going to go to the last dungeon of the game, which is the Tomb of the Watchers. So if I was going to emphasize what this title does, perhaps better than any of its contemporaries, is the classless skill system and the devotion passive system, and the way that those two intertwine seamlessly with one another. So beginning with the class system, every character has access to two classes simultaneously. In my case, I have the Demolitionist and the Soldier. And the way that those skills will interact with each other will really define what your character is good at. So in this case, I have a character that is primarily interested in range damage. So you have this base ability that you get at the beginning of the game called Fire Strike, which augments your pistol's damage with fire damage. Basically, you get burning bullets. But then as you level up the skill, it changes its characteristics. It becomes capable of stunning enemies. And then later on, it becomes capable of basically exploding into this huge cascade of bullet fragments. And that's very much how the development proceeds in this game, where you start off with a basic ability and it grows in power and does new things as the game progresses. Focusing on other things that are necessary in titles like this, we have crowd control through the ability of stun jacks. Basically, it throws these electrified caltrops on the ground, and any enemies that attempt to run directly at your character will be stunned, and that prevents you from getting overwhelmed. We also have Canister Bomb, which is additional AoE damage, often used and augmented for its stun capabilities, but in this case, I have it set up so that it creates a burning dot on all the enemies that that lowers its movement speed, its fire resistance, and chaos resistance. And that's called Eldritch Fire, which you actually get in the Devotion tree, but I'll go through that a little bit more later. Continuing on, we have our buffs. We have Vindictive Flame, which increases the total speed of the character, the health regeneration of the character, and it has a proc ability where if you're hit, there's a fire AoE that'll go off and stun all the enemies. And then that gets augmented with this lightning capability as well, where Chain Lightning will also periodically shoot off your character and stun all the enemies. We also have Flame Touched, which is purely an offensive ability that simply improves the elemental damage you're doing. And of course is important because you want to augment all those offensive abilities that you have with Demolitionist, and they're all primarily fire or lightning damage. Moving on to the Soldier side of the spectrum, I haven't taken a lot of abilities from the Soldier side because soldiers primarily deal with melee weapons, but they have some very strong passives. First of all, they're good with shields, and so I have shield training. I have Field Command, which is a very powerful aura that improves your offensive and defensive abilities, but also improves the amount of armor you have. We also have Squad Tactics, which is pure damage and attack speed. We have Decorated Soldier that improves your resistances, and the physical damage you're doing. And then finally, we have Scars of Battle, which is increasing your armor absorption and again, a lot of those resistances. So let's jump into the Devotion tree here, arguably the most unique part of Grim Dawn. Basically, there are millions of constellations in this game. You can see that all over here, we have all these different nodes that form up these constellations. and every single one does something entirely different from the next. So a big part of creating your character with these 50 devotion points, that's really where a lot of the class concentration comes in. So let's start with some of the weakest constellations, and they're all located right at the center here. The one that I have is the Falcon. So the Falcon improves your physical damage, your bleeding damage, and then finally at the end you get this proc ability called Falcon Swoop. So basically there's a 51% chance that whenever I use Demon's Breath, a whole flock of spiritual falcons comes flying out, and it'll attack all the enemies in a line. So that's fairly powerful, especially once it's leveled up. But then as you get farther out, the abilities only get more powerful. We have Elemental Storm that is tied to Stunjacks that creates this huge maelstrom of swirling elemental energy that continually does damage to any enemies caught in the center. More towards the left, we have Fissure that is tied to Fire Strike that creates an exploding volcano of fire and brimstone. We have that Dot, Eldritch Fire, that I spoke about previously, that lowers enemy resistances and allows you to do more damage to them. And then we have abilities that are tied to our defenses. Things like Messenger of War, where you have a 20% chance on being hit by a melee attack to greatly increase your speed and do more retaliation damage. And ultimately, the type of character you're going to end up with is going to be more than anything defined by your devotion choices. For example, if I was really interested in doing ice damage, I might invest in Amatok, the Spirit of Winter, and that would be a very important devotion for me to invest in if I was, for example, an Arcanist. But I'm not. I'm a Demolitionist, so I'm spec'd out for defense, and I'm spec'd out for elemental AoE damage. That's the way my character is built. So let's get into some trouble here and show off some of the abilities and the general flow of combat, so you can get an idea of really how easy it is. There's a very simplistic flow to combat, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So there's a lot of effects going off there, and I'm going to try to slow it down with the next group I meet. I'm just going to focus on using Fire Strike. So every time he shoots, you can see that there are these effects going off. There's the volcanoes I mentioned. So every time I fire my gun, there's a chance that it'll spawn a volcano. Moving on to Demon's Wrath, I'm going to show off the Falcon Swoop I mentioned previously. So you saw them right there, and that was a huge flock of spiritual falcons that decimate enemies in front of you. And finally, I have Canister Bomb, which is that big AoE explosive you see there that dots enemies. There we go, and that's it right there. So keep in mind, we are on the highest difficulty, and there is a lot going on behind the scenes, even if it doesn't seem like it. So really, if I was to sum up before ending this video about what Grim Dawn focuses on more so than any other titles in its family, it's proc effects. You start out with very simple abilities like Fire Strike, and then before you're done, your Fire Strike is going to be, resulting in exploding bullets and summoning volcanoes that will wreak havoc on the enemies. And that's very organic. You start because honestly, in any game that you start playing, you're not going to be very good. You're not going to understand the mechanics. So having a system that kind of starts you out at ground zero and builds you up over time is more enjoyable for players, even for players that aren't actually good at this style of game, like myself. I didn't play Diablo much. I haven't played any other titles in that genre, but I found it very easy to get started, and then just through the process of learning and creating a character, I was able to end up with something that is endgame compatible. I am in Ultimate Difficulty with all the strongest enemies in the game, and I was able to find loot that I thought fit my playstyle. For example, I have this Empowered Oathbreaker and Empowered Oath Guard, which again suits that kind of shoot and shield gameplay that I was looking for. You have the defensive capabilities along with the range capabilities. And then I just kind of found equipment that would stack elemental damage. It was very simple for me. Also, you have all your resistances over here, and of course you want to max them out at 80% if you can. So it was very simple to me. You have your damage per second. You can see how much damage you're doing and what you should be, how quickly you're killing enemies, and have a feel for something like that. So instead of me just talking now about the mechanics of the game, let's just see how far we can get in the game's final dungeon and see if my character, as someone who's a novice at this style of game, can stack up against the toughest things this game has on offer. Alright, now, this is something that I wanted to get into, and that's the art style. I felt that the thing that I loved about Diablo, that old Blizzard title, more so than anything else, wasn't necessarily the story, because I wasn't terribly engaged with what's going on. It was more so just the art style. Like, if you're gonna spend all this time in these dungeons, you want it to feel creepy, you want it to feel horrific, and you want to be scared. You want the demons of hell to make you afraid. And I definitely feel like this game does a good job of conveying that. There's blood all across the ground. You can see the enemies populated on the bottom here. Most of the maps have a lot of verticality to them, so you start up high, or you start up low and work your way back up, and that makes for a more interesting visual experience. There's a real sense of place to it all. Also, the game has great ragdoll system. Enemies will blow up and give, and it's all very tactile and very soothing, basically. There's a great flow to it all. And of course, by the end of the game, you do feel empowered. There's so many particle effects and so many proc effects that are going on that you feel like a real badass without actually having to do much more in terms of managing what's happening on screen. You just rotate through your abilities, and then everything ends up being dead, basically. And of course, as with all titles in this genre, you're always looking for loot, and there's lots of that here. Okay, so this is going to be the last group of mobs I take down. And we're just going to see how quickly we can do it by rotating through our abilities once again. Oh, and we're out of energy, so every now and again you can take a potion. But yeah, that's really it. So this was Nifty with Retro Roleplay, showing off a little Grim Dawn for our first episode. Alright, thanks for tuning in. Take care.